Welcome to the week 2 feedback video. This is Richard here in the studio, and once again Craig's touring the world teaching mindfulness.
Hi, it's Craig here from another galaxy far, far away, so good to be with you, albeit from a remote location. Hi to Richard and the team.
Hi Craig. So it's been a very challenging week for a lot of our learners because as we start paying attention to the way that we relate to ourselves and others, we start to see perhaps some uncomfortable habits and patterns. And a lot of learners also have started to express regret that even if they're starting to perhaps change those habits now that they've lived their lives, perhaps with attitudes of self-criticism and self-judgment. And it's really important to, once we start seeing what we're doing in the here and now, it's important not to judge that, just to bring that into awareness. Because I guess what we're really doing is taking things that have been hidden from us, and when we bring mindfulness to them, we kind of bring them up into awareness so we can start to see them and we can start to work with things more effectively. So it's very important not to then judge ourselves and make ourselves wrong for the habits that we have. There's a big difference actually between empathy and compassion, and that's something that a lot of our learners found very interesting this week. And Craig's got some really interesting things to say about that.
Now, there's been some interesting discussion this week about compassion and empathy and how to tell the difference. I think one of the key ways is to notice the effect that it has on us. So when we experience empathy in the sense of noticing somebody in pain and we feel distressed by their pain, agitated by it, then that creates a kind of a stress in our own system. So areas of the brain associated with stress are activated as they are for the person who's experiencing the actual adversity. But compassion is different. And we'll notice that if we experience compassion for somebody who's in pain, then there's a kind of a softening of the emotional state and also the physiological state as well. So areas of the brain that are activated are quite different to empathy. Rather than the stress centers associated with negative mood, there are other areas of the brain associated with positive mood. And this is, and you would reflect, if you're paying attention to your own body and mind, to notice that when you experience compassion, although there might be sadness, there's not the same level of agitation. There's a kind of a welling up of care or consideration. And it might be one of the main reasons why, for example, when people are going through adversity in their life, and there's research on this as well to show that when people do things for others, when people contribute to the well-being of others in various charitable ways, etc., it actually protects them from the negative impact of stress compared to people who are experiencing adversity but aren't doing things for others. And I think because that contribution to the well-being of others is actually mobilizing that compassion, and it helps to alleviate the distress, replaces, if you like, a very negative emotion with a very positive one.
And of course, sometimes we just can't really do anything. Maybe somebody's on the other side of the world, we're watching the news and we're feeling sort of, distressed or feeling some compassion for their plight. Or maybe it's someone really close to us, but there's nothing that we can say, nothing that we can do to ease their suffering. And so compassion doesn't always mean acting. Sometimes we might just wish for the happiness of somebody else. And that's, of course, what compassion meditation and loving kindness meditation are all about. We could just make wishes for that person, at least change our own mind, start to cultivate qualities like compassion and empathy, which will then, of course, start to, infuse our behaviours and our words. And in a way, that will have ripple effects out into the world. Sometimes if the person's close to us, it's just about being present. Maybe there's nothing we can say, but just to listen or to sit quietly with them, just to be present with them, just to do something nice with them. Even those things can be acts of compassion. So it's definitely not about trying to fix their problem. And it's also, of course, not about, some of our learners noted, I've got this real need to be needed by other people, and maybe is that different to compassion? And of course it is, because if we're trying to get something through our actions, if we're trying to, be compassionate to get some recognition or some validation or form an identity around that, it gets a bit constricted rather than being that genuine compassion, which comes from, I guess you'd say, an open heart. And if you look at the wisdom traditions, really compassion comes from a recognition that we're all connected. We all want to be happy, and we all experience stress and difficulties in our lives, which causes suffering for us. And if we can recognize that other people are the same in that way as us, that leads to genuine compassion, where it's not something that we create or do, it's not an identity, but it's just a genuine recognition that just as we suffer sometimes, other people suffer. We don't like it, they don't like it. And so when we connect with it on that level, it leads to a sort of a spontaneous compassion. And that's where mindfulness is really important, to start recognizing those similarities between us and other people. Something else that we explored over the past week was how to use things like mindfulness and compassion in difficult relationships, perhaps where there's conflict or some entrenched patterns that we're finding difficult. And Craig's got some really interesting things to say about that.
It's very hard to make others respect boundaries, to make others do anything for that matter. And it can be extremely frustrating to expect that we can, and how will mindfulness help us to do that? Well, maybe mindfulness can help us to be aware of others' needs, to communicate in a more effective way, to communicate our needs. But at the end of the day, we don't have control over others. Responsibility is just the ability to respond, and we only have the ability to respond for ourselves, not for other people. So the attempt to control others can be a very disheartening and dispiriting thing. All we can do is be in control of ourselves. So acting with awareness, acting with discernment, but also realizing that we're in control of our own attitude. And so we can choose to accept that others may not be reasonable, others may not be caring, but we have to make a decision for ourselves how to respond in the face of that. There'll be reasons why other people are very difficult at times, their own suffering, their own unawareness of what they're doing and how they're behaving, and just as it's the case for ourselves as well. So we can only be understanding, but at the end of the day, it's our own boundaries we need to set, it's our own decisions we need to make.
And some of our learners were asking for practical strategies about how to manage conflict and how to set boundaries. And I think two of the best strategies that I've discovered that I use in my life and I teach my clients to use in my private practice are pausing and communicating needs. Pausing means if we notice that we're caught up in the middle of some reactive pattern, we're feeling stressed or there's some conflict or we're losing our sense of mindfulness and groundedness, just to pause for a moment, reconnect with the body, take a breath, just come back to ourselves and ground ourselves. It gets us out of those patterns that we often find ourselves in. So we step out of that for a moment, and that pause can be a really important thing to practice, and sometimes to practice a lot. And then there's communicating needs. There's a mediation framework called nonviolent communication, which is about communicating our needs clearly. And a formula that I really like is that underneath any unpleasant emotion, things like fear and sadness and anger, are unmet needs. If we're experiencing positive or pleasant emotions, our needs are generally being met in those moments. So if we're getting frustrated with somebody, or our feelings are hurt, or we're feeling sad, it's very useful just to pause and notice that emotion, and then just bring some mindfulness to what might be underneath that. Perhaps we need connection or support or acknowledgement, and that's not getting met. Maybe someone's doing something that isn't meeting our need for respect, or we're feeling unsafe. And so to recognize the need means that we can then very clearly ask for that need to be met. And it makes it much easier to have good boundaries. And of course, also, if we're clearly communicating our needs to somebody else, they're much more able to meet those needs, especially if we then invite them to meet it. And that's at the heart of nonviolent communication. We're not demanding or manipulating with guilt trips that person into meeting our needs, but we're asking for it. And that can be a very powerful way of communicating. There were also some really interesting observations by some of our learners. Some of you guys obviously are carers, and this realization that perhaps if there's a difficult situation, we need to put our own oxygen mask on first so that we can more effectively help others. So the value of self-care, I think that's a really important thing to start noticing and practicing. And then another realization that If anybody who's difficult to be around is perhaps unhappy, maybe that's true of children. So when children are having a tantrum or being difficult, perhaps they're unhappy on some level. Maybe their needs aren't being met, they're just a bit tired, something's happening for them. And so realizing that can also make us a little bit more compassionate and perhaps patient when kids are grizzling and acting up. So that's it for this week. Next week, we're going to look at self-compassion and also how to use mindfulness to work with pain, whether that's physical pain or emotional pain, things like anxiety and depression and grief. The material, again, can be quite challenging. We've noticed in past runs of the course that it can sometimes really, really challenge people. And so, again, just a reminder to go slowly, to feel free to skip any of the exercises, to adapt them. You might want to come back to them later. You might want to sort of cultivate some more mindfulness or some more loving kindness or compassion, and then return to some of the more challenging exercises once those muscles are a bit stronger. And so it's really about going through this at your own pace and really taking care of yourself as you do this.
That's all from me. I'll look forward to being in the studio with the team next week. So I hope you have a great week and continue to really bring more mindfulness into your life as clear as is happening from the discussions on the discussion boards.
So we'll see you next week.